Hello, and welcome to Dining with Death. This episode is on my playlist, Dining with the Damned, where we talk about criminals who have been sentenced to die. We talk about their lives and how they ended up on death row, and then I show you and taste their last meal before execution. I'm Stacey Lee. Let's begin. Gerald Lee Mitchell was born on December 27, 1967. Other than that, we don't know a lot about his life prior to his offenses. In fact, we don't know much about this story at all. This is one of those crimes that has been long forgotten, perhaps to everyone but the people directly affected. Part of what I do here on Dining with Death is memorialize these older stories by talking about them. I think it's a shame when some victims are forgotten, and I think it's important to preserve their stories and preserve the outcome. What happened to their killer? There simply isn't a lot of information on this man or on this crime, but that doesn't mean that the victims don't matter, and it doesn't mean that their lives were any less important than victims whose cases get a lot of attention. In June of 1985, 18-year-old Gerald Lee Mitchell was scraping his way through a tough life in Houston, Texas. Like so many other teenagers growing up in poverty, Gerald turned to selling drugs as a way to get by. From what I was able to gather, he dropped out of school in the 10th grade. I tried to find information on whether or not he was in a gang, but couldn't verify that. Knowing a lot about that time period, I would guess there was some type of affiliation because the gangs, all gangs, white, black, Asian, were kind of in charge of all drug sales then. If you weren't affiliated with a gang and you got caught selling drugs, it was very bad for you. Gerald Lee Mitchell had set a date with two men to sell them some marijuana. The men were 20-year-old Charles Marino and his brother-in-law, Kenneth Fleming. They had agreed to meet Gerald Lee Mitchell in the Acres Home area of Houston. The trio was set to meet at one of the local parks in that town. The park is called Lincoln City Park. Charles and Kenneth arrived in Charles' Trans Am, and they walked towards the park and saw Gerald Lee Mitchell there waiting for them. The three then got back into the Trans Am, and Gerald directed the men where to drive. Gerald then got out of the car and retrieved a weapon he had hidden for just these events. Gerald then returned to the dead end where he had told Charles and Kenneth to pull over, and he pulled out a sawed-off shotgun that he had hidden down the leg of his sweatpants, and he pointed it at the two men. A sawed-off shotgun is a really dangerous weapon. It can shoot several people at a time because it puts out a large spray of ammunition. In fact, when I was going through my divorce and I was living alone, and then again when my daughters were in college and they were living in a little house together, my dad told them, if you're going to have a weapon, have a sawed-off shotgun, because if you're nervous, if it's dark, if you can't see well, if your heart's racing, you pull that trigger and a spray of ammunition goes everywhere. It's kind of the safest home defense weapon because you don't have to have good aim and you don't have to be calm, and have a perfectly steady hand to use it. It just kind of blasts. So Gerald then tries to force Charles and Kenneth into the trunk of the Trans Am, but the men refused to get inside. Gerald then forced them to walk to a vacant house at 8806 DePriest in the neighborhood. Gerald forced the men at gunpoint inside the vacant house. He then robbed them of the $25 they had on them, and he took the car keys from Charles Marino. Gerald Lee Mitchell ordered both men onto the floor into sitting positions, and then very cowardly and coldly shot them both with his 12-gauge shotgun from about 10 feet away. Gerald Lee Mitchell then fled the scene and left town. The problem for Gerald? He hadn't killed Kenneth Fleming. Charles Marino was dead on sight, but Kenneth had only been shot in the arm and the hip. He lay still on the floor pretending to be dead, and luckily for him, Gerald Lee Mitchell wasn't smart enough to check and ensure he'd done the job. Kenneth dragged himself from the vacant house and was able to go and get help. The police were called, and the hunt for the killer was on. Some of these crimes and these criminals are just despicable, doesn't even cover it. To order two men onto the floor and then just shoot them execution style as they lay there helpless, you've got to be a scumbag to do something like that, right? A manhunt ensued for Gerald Lee Mitchell. The police knew he was dangerous. He had just shot two men over practically nothing, so area officers were advised to approach him with caution if they located Gerald. After about 7 days, a police officer spotted Gerald in Corpus Christi. He was ordered to the ground and taken into custody without much incident. He was then transported back to Houston and put on trial for attempted capital murder for the shooting of Kenneth Fleming. Gerald was also charged with the capital murder of Charles Angelo Marino and went to trial for that crime. On April 11, 1986, Gerald Lee Mitchell was sentenced to death for that murder. The police then linked Gerald Lee Mitchell to the shooting and murder of a man named Hector Managua. On the same day Gerald shot Charles and Kenneth, he had had a second encounter. So this would put Gerald Lee Mitchell into the category of spree killer. Killers that kill more than one victim aren't always serial killers. Sometimes they're spree killers, killers that go on kind of a rampage that lasts a day, maybe a few days. Gerald had come upon Hector Managua and demanded that he give him the necklace he was wearing. Well, Hector refused, and so Gerald just shot him and murdered him where he stood. This guy had no moral compass whatsoever. He was just a disgusting and evil person who had no regard for anyone but himself. There was actually evidence introduced at trial that Gerald Lee Mitchell committed an armed robbery at a savings and loan in January of 1985 before the murders. Police also linked him to the attempted robbery of a Baskin-Robbins in 1983, some purse thefts, and an incident at Gerald's school where he pointed a .357 Magnum at another student. So this guy, he was just a bad guy altogether. Gerald was imprisoned and sat on death row for more than a decade. He went through the usual appeals process, but there was no denying what he had done. There was no evidence for any attorney, no matter how good, that could make a strong argument or any type of case for Gerald's innocence. Finally, it was time for him to face his punishment. On October 22, 2001, Gerald Lee Mitchell was moved from death row at the Harris County Prison in Texas to the Death Watch cell. He was allowed some visitors and was given what he requested for his last meal, which of course I'm going to show you. Then he was taken to the death chamber and asked if he would like to give a last statement. He said, "Where's Mr. Marino's mother? Did you get my letter? Just wanted to let you know I sincerely meant everything I wrote. I am sorry for the pain. I am sorry for the life I took from you. I ask God for forgiveness and I ask you for the same. I know it may be hard, but I'm sorry for what I did. To my family, I love each and every one of you. Be strong. Know my love is always with you, always. I know I am going home to be with the Lord. Shed tears of happiness for me. Keep on living. Jesus, I confess you as my Lord and Savior. I know when I die, I'll have life in heaven and life eternal everlasting. I am ready for that mansion that you promised me. It's all right. I'm going to a better place." Yeah, I'm just going to keep my mouth shut. I'm going to get myself into trouble. Those kinds of statements bother me. I'm sure that if you know it's your last day on earth, you're thinking about Jesus or, what might be coming your way, but I don't think those are things that you say out loud to the families of the people that you murdered. After he gave his last statement, Gerald Lee Mitchell was then put to death by lethal injection. He was pronounced dead at 6:25 p.m. What did Gerald Lee Mitchell request and receive for his last meal? I'm going to show you. Are you ready for this? A bowl of Jolly Rancher candies. This is definitely one of the stranger requests that I have seen. I mean, I love a Jolly Rancher. Would it be my last meal? Absolutely not. For my foreign viewers, Jolly Ranchers are little hard candies, and they have very intense fruit flavors. Green apple, blue raspberry, watermelon. When I was a kid, they made peach. That was my favorite. And they also made one called Fire Stick that was cinnamon. I haven't seen those for a really long time. They have grape, but I think the watermelon one is probably the best, don't you? And the green apple, so let's give them a try. . That takes me right back to junior high. The watermelon Jolly Ranchers are bomb. They taste so good. They're just super, super watermelon flavored, really intensely candy flavored. Let's try a different flavor. One thing I never saw on my bingo card of life was how to remove a candy from my mouth on camera. I didn't see that coming. Here's the green apple. Oh yeah. When I was growing up in Cedar City, there was this little store on the corner by my grandma's house called Cornet. And they sold Jolly Ranchers. They used to come in sticks too, like a long thin stick. And I'd always get this flavor. Isn't it weird how flavors and smells and songs they're like a time machine. I mean, at least for me. I know for a lot of you, we've talked about it in the comments, but yeah, that is little kid summer in Cedar City. Jolly Ranchers, they are really good candy. I'd say probably some of the better American candies for sure. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, Dining with the Damned. Hit the like button if you liked the video and subscribe to my channel if you want to support me. You can also support me by joining my Patreon. And you know, the ultimate goal there is to start raising money for police departments that have cold case DNA in storage that cannot be tested because there's no money to test it. Our community is going to get involved in helping some of those departments out. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.